I want to thank FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call for hosting this discussion today. Both FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call have, in advance of this webinar, put together a comprehensive report on the state of regulations and a deep dive analysis into individual and organizational commenting patterns from the past decade. They explore how many comments have been received between 2009 and 2019, which agencies obtained the most comments, and additionally answered certain questions on the last 3 years of the Obama administration and the first 3 years of the Trump administration. Download the report by going to FiscalNote.com today. I can really say that this is an incredible resource for the advocacy community. Next, I'd like to call to your attention to both the Q&A box and the chat box on your screen. You can use either of these to submit questions throughout the webinar. Please submit your questions at any time. We'll attempt to get to as many as possible during the 1 hour that we're here together. This session is being recorded, so afterwards you'll be sent a copy of this event. Everyone should be in muted mode upon entry, but if you're not, with the exception of our panelists, and for the benefit of our audience, please ensure your microphone is on mute. Today, I'm joined by two industry experts who will help guide the conversation and share their unique insights. They have also agreed to answer unscripted audience questions for you. We're coming to you from 3 separate locations today, so please excuse the variations in sound quality and slight pauses. Without further ado, I'm Joshua Habursky. I'm the head of government affairs for the Premium Cigar Association and an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. I'm honored that FiscalNote has asked me to moderate this session, and I've worked with them over many years in my capacity as the founder of the Grassroots Professional Network and contributing editor for Campaigns and Elections magazine. I'm joined by Dimitri Karakitos, who is a partner at Holland & Knight. Dimitri, welcome to the program. Can you tell us a little bit about your background to get us started with the audience?
Sure, and thanks for that, Josh. As Josh mentioned, my name is Dimitri Karakitos. I'm a partner at Holland & Knight. I've been with the firm for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I spent 8 years in the Senate working on the Environment and Public Works Committee, focused on a whole range of issues from infrastructure, environmental permit streamlining, chemicals, energy issues. Got to work on a host of kind of hot topics of the day, including the Keystone Pipeline, the BP oil spill, and was fortunate enough to work on a few large pieces of legislation that ended up passing and being signed into law, including infrastructure bills and environmental reforms. Now my work is primarily for a multitude of clients before Congress and also the administration and regulatory agencies.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'm also joined by Tanya Saunders, who is a principal at the Washington Premier Group. Good morning, Tanya.
Hello and good morning. Thank you, Joshua. It's so good to be with you and of course, to be invited to participate on this panel. I'm Tanya Saunders, as noted. I am the principal of Washington Premier Group and the legislative representative currently for federally employed women, known as FEW. I've been engaged in public affairs and legislative issues for more than a couple of decades, starting first on Capitol Hill in the office of Senator Jay Rockefeller. I've been involved in strategic advocacy, advising clients, advancing legislative initiatives. I've represented a myriad of clients on healthcare, small business, defense contracting, telecom, among other issues, to include trade associations and coalitions. Also, some major corporations like Microsoft, Delta Airlines, and even Kodak, just to name a few. And I sit currently on the board of the National Women's Party, and I'm a senior advisor to the Peter Damon Group. But on this day and this time, I can't allow the moment to pass also without acknowledging Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I extend my deepest condolences to her family and friends, and may she rest in peace.
Thank you, Tanya. So we have a wealth of experience in different areas. I want to start with a little bit of a state of play before we get into the questions. With the legislative process slowed down and in gridlock, we have seen a shift to executive action and regulations in the policymaking sphere. At the Premium Cigar Association, we've been working for over the past year at leveraging our legislative and litigation resources to affect the regulatory process. And we're recently successful at overturning parts of a regulation in the courts that would significantly impact our retail and manufacturing members. In this discussion, I want to emphasize the interconnectedness of a regulatory process and how critically important it is to government relations and advocacy, and even more so in the current political climate. The Trump administration has taken a deregulatory stance from the very beginning, working to overturn many of the regulations that were promulgated during the Obama administration. Early on in the administration, I worked with the Coalition on the Waters of the United States rule, and it was in financial services working on regulatory relief while at the Independent Community Bankers of America, and saw firsthand the opportunity to change policy with a combined legislative and regulatory approach. However, there are some examples of agencies in this administration that have continued to proliferate new regulations in the midst of the new deregulatory policy and executive order. We are now in the midst of a contentious election cycle, and organizations are looking for guidance on how to approach the regulatory climate, given all of the variables and possible outcomes. Our experts will discuss successful regulatory strategies and provide ways for trade associations, corporations, and nonprofit organizations to build effective regulatory advocacy programs, irrespective of the November 3rd outcome. I want to start my question. I know that we had talked in the beginning about FiscalNote and some of the research that they have put together. Another a great resource that they've provided is their public affairs survey. And according to this survey, the number one concern for more than 50% of public affairs workers are regulations. How would you explain that statistic, and why are regulations so concerning? And I want to start with Tanya.
Thank you. I want to, from my experience, to look at that question. I suspect a number of government affairs shops today are concerned about regs, as you pointed out. That is where a lot of direction and directives are coming from. And with traditional public affairs shops or government affairs shops, it's more difficult to monitor federal agencies for actions and changes to rules and regulations as they go through the entire comment period. For example, it can take from 60 days to 180 days for the entire process to be finalized. And sometimes comments can have an impact. And then you have to continue to monitor what's known as the Federal Register. If we look at how regulations occur, to be clear, Congress passes a law which creates an agency, grants that agency the general authority to regulate certain activities. Well, within that law, more specifically, it directs an agency to solve a particular problem or accomplish a goal. Then agencies are supposed to follow and must follow an open public process where they issue the regs according to the Administrative Procedure Act, which includes publishing the statement of rulemaking authority in the Federal Register for all proposed and final rules. And if you don't have a dedicated resource to follow the process as it moves along, then you could easily miss something that could be very important to your issue that you may have lobbied very well to get something passed, but then at the end of the day, it may change.
And I think that a lot of people in government relations and organizations can effectively and pretty easily explain the legislative process to get grassroots advocates involved in it, whereas the regulatory process tends to be a lot more complex and more challenging to get your average, member or part of your organization involved to tap in. I want to shift over. Dimitri, do you have anything to add to the explanation of that statistic?
Yeah, I thought Tanya did a great job, but what I would add, I think, is, to me, regulations are really the primary way that the federal government's laws and policies ultimately impact, businesses and individuals. So they can have a tremendous kind of cost and complexity. There are also just a ton of regulations in every space, in every field, in the tax world, in healthcare world, and manufacturing, energy, and compliance is obviously important, but it's also very difficult, and it doesn't, while a new law kind of grants the authority, right? A new administration can view that authority differently and can alter those regulations. So you're in an ever-changing landscape, and that to me is kind of one of the challenges there, is making sure that you're up to date with that landscape, you're following that landscape, and you're shaping that to the extent that you can, and providing your input as you go from an Obama administration to a Trump administration to whoever's next.
And you both pointed out in your response to that question, the public comment process and engaging organizations, and that how can trade organizations, nonprofit groups, and corporations influence the public comment process? What are some tips and tricks for effective public comments? I want to start with Dimitri on that one. How have you advised organizations that you've worked with on that process?
Yeah, I mean, look, to me, influencing the public comment process is really a multi-step approach, and requires a much more comprehensive strategy than just writing and submitting some comments. For starters, when a rule is coming, it's often announced in advance, or the priorities of an administration or agency. You can get in there with the meeting to discuss the potential impacts, and share your perspective. Once the comment period has opened, of course, you want your comments to be thorough, persuasive. They should not only be factually accurate, but substantive. You also really want to make sure they're written with your target audience in mind. Know what the goal is of the regulation, the goal of, or the policy position of the leadership overseeing the regulation. And then you want to follow up on those comments. Don't just submit them and hope they're persuasive on their own. You can go meet with the appropriate decision makers, and that goes from career officials at agencies, up to through leadership in the program office, in the administrator or secretary's office, and sometimes you need to go beyond that, beyond just the agency. You can go to places like the Office of Management and Budget. You can go to the National Economic Council, depending on the rules and regulations, or the Office of the Vice President or the President. So effective commenting is much more of a process, and to me requires some sustained work and interaction. I think the last thing I would say is, it's also always helpful to find allies to join your efforts and kind of echo your position. So can you submit joint comments with other companies or trade associations or NGOs? Can you work with members of Congress to kind of echo those comments and concerns? So it's a pretty, broad, holistic, comprehensive way that I view influencing the public comment process.
I would agree completely. In a case study example in the public comment process that we've worked on at the Premium Cigar Association, we'll submit 100+ page public comment that has the research and the resources of the industry. A lot of times we'll jointly submit our comments with Cigar Rights of America, which is a consumer group, but we'll also try and prep some of our individual shop owners, retailers, and manufacturers to submit their own independent comments. So, really taking that template and that large body of research in that public comment and breaking it down and explaining it further and doing those follow-up meetings. And we've had, a half dozen meetings with the White House Office of Domestic Policy about our issue that stems from the public comment process. And as you correctly pointed out, when one door is stalled or working on other things in the public health space with COVID-19, a lot of the principles that are charged with the authority of our issues, we're obviously working on more important things for society in the response to COVID. So we had to find different ways of getting our issues front and center that were part of that process. And conversely, the other thing I would say is utilizing grassroots and getting those retailers for us to weigh in and support our comments was equally as important. We had heard, from the agency itself in past public comments that they were so weighted against the opposition to our policy perspective that we needed to provide more resources and more voices to counter those mechanisms. So public comments, whether it's your trade association or your corporation or a nonprofit submitting them, or an average citizen going in there, and many average citizens, they do have an impact. People at the agencies are reading them and processing them and tallying them to an extent and weighing them for and against on any issues. Tanya, do you have any tips and tricks that you would like to add to the conversation on effective public comments?
Well, I think both covered it extremely well and took a lot of the points that I had made note of. And yes, I have to agree with Josh. It does take a separate strategy for the regulatory side of the aisle versus the lobbying side, although they're both married to the same end. And in addition, I would just simply say you may want to have a legal resource on hand. So Dimitri didn't mention that in his modesty, but it does help to have some legal counsel on the structure of your comments, as well as the overall points that you're trying to get across, so that it's very clear when you submit those comments. And to note, once a rule is final, then it's a lot harder to change it at that point. One of my former colleagues used to always say, and he was a former commissioner, he would say it's hard to outspit a bureaucrat when it comes to changing, changing the direction, but it can be done. That's all I have.
Absolutely, and I agree with you about the legal necessity to have those for all of the public comments that we submit. Most of them are drafted by a committee, but largely focused by legal staff that submit these, because at the end of the day, whatever's submitted to the public in that process can be viewed by other entities, the opposition, and can also affect future outcomes. Again, in my opening monologue, I talked a lot about the interconnectedness of it. Whatever you put in that public comment has the opportunity to be utilized in the courts and in the litigation side of things. So that's critically important. I want to shift a little bit over to the President Trump and his executive order on January 30th, 2017. This essentially required 2 regulations to be rolled back for every new regulation put forth by an agency. How has this action affected the regulatory environment? And Dimitri, I'd like to start with you on this question.
Sure. In my view, this executive order was more kind of ceremonial than anything. Had it been released or not, this administration was clear it was going to be strongly focused on the deregulatory, agenda that the president campaigned on. the EO was really a signal to the business community that the administration viewed the regulatory environment as being excessively burdensome, and I think they wanted it. They were making it a priority to provide regulatory relief with the ultimate goal of creating economic growth, spurring investment that may have been previously on the sidelines, and dealing with some of the regulatory burdens and uncertainty that the business community faced. It has been very interesting. It has been very challenging. I can tell you the agencies we've been working with have always taken it very seriously. I worked on, actually trying to advance a regulation very early on in the administration that was a holdover from the previous administration. And there were a significant number of discussions on, okay, well, if we move this forward, how do we do the accounting, and where are we removing regulations? So I think it has been impactful. I think that they've gone over, the for every new we remove two. So again, a lot of it was kind of a signaling process, I think, to businesses and to the market.
Absolutely. And I think from our perspective in the association, we utilize this as a key messaging document to congressional allies that we needed to put pressure. And we built a coalition of many members of Congress on our regulation that we were trying to affect, principally, and work with the Florida delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation in particular, where we have a lot of stakeholders that reside in those states. And that document there in 2017 was important for us to kind of coalesce around, stating that there is momentum for this, that we may be able to get a positive outcome, and that we need the support of congressional allies to put pressure on the administration. And as you pointed out, Dimitri, work through some of the other channels of the White House and the administration to get traction on that and really say, hey, the president is made this commitment. This is an executive order. This is in line with this executive order. So we really utilize that as an umbrella to assert our policy that we wanted to have changed that would fall under the deregulatory agenda. Tanya, how do you see the current regulatory environment under the Trump administration and this executive order?
From the standpoint of certain industries, and I'm speaking primarily from the contracting world in this respect, it can be at times a bit confusing for an industry because of the long-term planning that they make and take into account when they're operating under a certain rule or regulation. And when those things change, then we're looking at an additional investment that has to be made from the industry standpoint, from that company standpoint, so in order to be compliant. Currently, DOD has issued that contractors that do business, for example, small businesses, have to be compliant with the new certification called CMMC, which is in cybersecurity world. So there are a number of very small businesses now that are trying to meet those standards, and that came specifically from from DOD. Then you also have GSA now suggesting that all contractors, not that it's a bad thing, it's just, again, when looking at what kind of rules, what kind of regulations come forth from any agency, there is going to be a certain consequence, or in some cases, unintended consequences to businesses who are trying to comply. So that's sort of my perspective in the larger sense. So I hope that also helps others as they look at changes, possibly with an incoming, different incoming administration as well. and the current one that we are operating with today.
And that's a perfect segue into my next series of questions. You know, obviously the folks that are listening in on this are trying to prepare their organizations to approach regulatory advocacy and the process accordingly. Dimitri, I want to start with you on how would you advise organizations to approach regulatory advocacy if President Trump is reelected?
Yeah, so, I think some of this applies in any circumstance, in any administration or with any elected official. I think you have to first have a good understanding of their interests, their policy objectives. If you're meeting with staff or folks at an agency, the ultimate interest of the decision makers and their bosses. When you look at the Trump administration, they're very focused on easing regulatory burdens, trying to drive increased investment, domestic job creation. You definitely want to frame your advocacy in ways that align with their broader goals. I think you have to kind of speak their language and structure your arguments in ways that your audience is most receptive and sympathetic. And then I would go back to, what we talked about earlier with that coalition building. If there are other folks that are influential in the administration, whether they're trade associations, NGOs, members of Congress, how can you get them involved to kind of echo your message and make sure that everybody's kind of speaking the administration's language and advocating as effectively as possible?
Absolutely. And I think, in our organization, we have kind of a two-tracked approach and we are putting our materials together if the president is reelected and have a regulatory advocacy strategy for that, but also have been approaching and talking to folks that are likely to be involved in the Biden administration should they take over some key agencies. And, you can identify early on some of the different priorities by looking at the congressional record and seeing what has been done by the different parties on the legislative front and what might be the priorities and the focus and the way that they would approach, each administration would approach your regulatory sector that your organization covers. Tanya, I want to ask you, how would you advise organizations that are approaching regulatory advocacy, first, if President Trump is reelected, and then secondly, if Joe Biden is elected in November?
Sure. Again, I would advise clients to expect more of the same in respect to the deregulatory environment that President Trump has touted and has implemented during his past almost 4 years. And if former Vice President Biden is successful in his bid, I would suggest that you look at former Obama-Biden policies, because from the platform that I've seen and from the stump speech that the former vice president has made, he's emphasizing those policies and enhancing those policies. I would also suspect that in both campaigns that platform, priorities, and potential. What do I mean by that? Platform, what is the platform? What does it appear that are going to be positions moving forward? The priorities with both candidates, and the potential of legislation passing based upon who holds the House and Senate. And as Dimitri pointed out, a lot of this can be found in the congressional record where members stand, but also to underscore the point, and I like, Josh, what you mentioned about your organization, that you have a two-track strategy. And a lot of legislative affairs shops should be prepared as well, because the messenger and the message are important when trying to advocate, regardless of who's in the White House. But to know how to speak to both types of administrations is very important.
Absolutely. I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions through the chat box or the Q&A box for our panelists. I want to go into the next section of my questions that are a little bit more policy specific. You know, we've seen in the past 4 years a significant rollback in energy, environment, and financial services regulations in particular. Tanya, how do you think that these policy areas will be affected after the November election? And I'm sure I've missed a policy area in there that we've seen a rollback. If you want to comment on any issue-specific areas where you think there's going to be a dramatic shift, feel free to do so.
Okay. Well, it is very possible, given the fires that are burning in California, Oregon, Washington, to assume that under Biden-Harris administration that climate change will be one of their top priorities, and that money will be focused there. But notwithstanding COVID, which is a country-wide concern during this pandemic, worldwide concern, that too will be an area of, I believe, extreme ramp up in a coordinated effort of addressing testing and tracing and PPE manufacturing, which could create more jobs. Also, with Congress, depending again upon who's in charge, there's something called a Congressional Review Act, and that's a tool that Congress can use to remove regulations that are issued under a previous administration. So we may see a lot more activity with congressional House, either the House and Senate, or the House, using their authority to reinstall or remove certain policies. So I think there's going to be a scurry of activity based upon who wins the White House.
Absolutely. Dimitri, I want to shift to you on the specific policy areas, irrespective of the outcome of the election. What are some policy areas that you think will be affected in the regulatory sphere come post-November?
Yeah, I think your examples of, energy environment is a great example. The Trump administration has done a lot of work and in a lot of ways prided itself off of some rollbacks and changes to Obama era policies. Certainly you can see that continue, and really the Trump administration will continue defending the current regulatory rollbacks in future and current legal challenges to continue. In an Obama administration, it would be, in a potential Biden administration, you would see a lot of those Obama era policies come back. And I think really, given the climate and where the political parties are now, probably a push to go even more aggressive in some of those spaces. It does depend on who controls Congress. And, one thing we could, I'm sure, talk quite a bit about is the potential for some changes to Senate rules and things like that make it easier to pass legislation and have it be less bipartisan. So you could see not only a regulatory change just internally at the agencies, but also Congress passing more aggressive laws that force new regulations. And like I said, climate change, energy, prime example, where President Trump is focused on kind of growing domestic energy production. And then you'd have a Biden administration that would be much more focused on, clean energy, transition away from conventional energy resources, issues like environmental justice, and making sure underprivileged and minority communities are heavily considered in in potential rulemakings and things like that. So it leaves a lot of uncertainty and the potential for a large swing one way or the other.
Absolutely. On the congressional side, I kind of want to follow up with the question, if the Senate rules aren't changed, what do you see as the instrument where a lot of action is going to be taken? If there is this congressional gridlock that still exists, are we going to see the continued proliferation of executive orders and a continued emphasis on the regulatory process, or are we going to return to traditional legislative action on many of these major policy issues, or even the shift to the states and localities taking on some of these major policy decisions? You've seen specifically on energy and the environment, states getting involved in otherwise national or international issues. Is that a trend that you foresee continuing?
Is the question to
I'll start with you, Tanya.
Oh, actually, I suspect the answer is yes, and there may be a hybrid of that under a Biden-Harris administration. Under current administration, we've seen this, as you pointed out, Josh, already. But, the administration has passed down, for example, with COVID even, the PPE supply and trying to address the needs of the states. So there are other areas states have stepped in as well that aren't as widely known, such as housing and cyber security, privacy issues, technology issues, now that those things are forefront and center since we're basically all working from remotely here. Those types of things states are now having to deal with because of local governments, just as the federal government can't fully operate in the buildings where they once were. So we're seeing, I think, a dynamic here in respect to local governments taking on some of these challenges simply because they have to. And again, whether, Biden and Harris make it in to the White House, I believe some of those areas where states stepped up, New York, California, especially the larger states, you're going to still see some of that. I was surprised when I heard, I believe it was the governor of Michigan, who spoke some weeks ago about a regional group of governors coming together and determining how they were going to handle certain issues and making plans regionally. So I suspect that some of this will continue.
Dimitri, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I really agree. I mean, in our kind of federalist system, it's not all the states doing it. It's not all the federal government doing it. There's a blend. And as administrations change, priorities change. And, where the Obama administration, for example, wanted to take strong leadership on some of these, energy environment issues or climate change. The Trump administration has not, and that has led to states like California, New York feeling forced to step up and take a larger role in those. And I think that's fine and appropriate in many ways. So I think you'll see a kind of a mix of interactions between state and federal, no matter who's in charge.
Absolutely. So many government affairs departments are adding in regulatory specialists to their staff or hiring consultants to explain and engage in the regulatory process. If you scroll LinkedIn or any of the job sites, you'll see a lot of new positions opening up in trade groups and corporations to really focus in on the regulatory process. We're adding that part of job descriptions to external affairs roles or hybrid roles. What qualities should organizations be looking for when hiring or retaining regulatory staff? And I'll start with Tanya.
Well, I think the one obvious point would be that they have had some experience dealing with federal agencies and or state agencies or both. Also, legal experience helps. It's not always necessary as you look at filling a position, but it does help to understand statutes, laws, and how one affects the other. But more importantly is the understanding of both from the legislative process to the regulatory process and the final rulemaking process. So it would be helpful to have someone that has a backbench of experience understanding that process.
Absolutely. And I think for me, one of the key qualities when looking for regulatory guidance from whether it be consultants or in-house staff is really taking the complexity of the regulatory process and the regulations in particular, and being able to distill that down into something that's processable, explainable, and actionable by our members and different constituency. You know, obviously for any role in government affairs, writing and critical thinking and research are key skills. But I think even more so in the regulatory sector, you have to be able to explain explain complex policy issues to a variety of different groups and audiences. And sometimes you will be submitting it to the agency or a congressional staff that has a multitude of experience and understands the complexities of the situation and all of the dynamics and variables that come into play. But at other times, it's taking that 100-page and in some cases thousands of pages and processing it down into a one-pager or an infographic. And obviously that involves some coordination with other elements of staff. But for me, it's that communication to appropriate audiences that is important. Dimitri, what qualities do you think are important for regulatory specialists?
I think you two both absolutely nailed it. You know, it's a mix of having the experience, the technical knowledge, which is very important, but you know, equally, if not more so in some instances, the ability to communicate and translate that knowledge to different audiences. You know, there are definitely policies that, you know, the Trump administration and a potential Biden administration, you know, would agree on, but you don't always communicate, you know, the rationale or the justification for those policies the same way. So having the sense and the ability to not only boil it down in a simple way, but understand kind of the motivations of your audience, to me is critically important.
I'm going to go into one more question from my suite of questions, and then we have a few audience questions. For many of these webinars that I've done with FiscalNote, we've shared several case studies and examples of organizations. What is a case study that you've been involved with or seen in a notable organization that showcases a successful regulatory strategy implemented and really come together? Dimitri, I'm going to start with you on that question.
Yeah, I guess I'll go back to an example I alluded to. You know, at the very onset of the Trump administration, I was working with a client on trying to get an environmental regulation, actually, that had kind of lingered on at the end of the Obama administration and not been finalized, then finalized through the Trump administration. Not what you'd expect, certainly not what I thought one of the first things I would be doing for a client would be, given the focus on the deregulatory side. But it came down to, having good justifications for the argument, being able to explain it, understanding kind of their pressure points, knowing who to go to is often very important as well. So talking to the right people, both within the agency, in some of the, executive offices, in and around the White House, and work that process from a technical perspective, from a messaging perspective, a political perspective, and ultimately, and we had to deal with the 2-for-1 and help identify rules that would be removed in order to get this new one placed, because again, we were very early in the administration when they hadn't, even fulfilled or started some of their deregulatory processes, and ultimately, I think with that kind of comprehensive and methodical approach, we were able to get the Trump administration to issue that rule and to move forward, finalizing the action of the previous administration.
Absolutely. Tanya, do you have a case study example that you'd like to share?
Sure. I'll talk about, again, federal contracting. I founded an organization called Midterm Advocacy about 10 years ago, and we advocate on behalf of small and growing businesses. They're too big to be small and too small to be big. But this particular case study is in respect to the Small Business Runway Extension Act. We testified before the House Small Business Committee a few years ago on this very modest proposal to update the size formula for small business. And what it does, it allows a small business to have a 3-year, instead of a 3-year look back, a 5-year look back. So the House and Senate, ultimately, they passed a bill which included the Small Business Runway Extension Act. Now, this was done in a coalition of others, Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce, Polero Mazza, and a whole host of other small business representatives. But what we found after the bill passed was there was a concern of certain small businesses that this 5-year look back was going to not necessarily help them. So SBA decided to put out a proposed rule to include a 2-year phase-in approach, which, by the way, we supported. It didn't diminish at all the objective of what we were trying to achieve, which was to allow small businesses a little longer period of time to grow their capacity, to remain small longer. So the plan eventually allowed a business to decide if the 3-year or the 5-year look back was best for the business. And then SBA, in its after receiving comments from a number of people, we weighed in as well, decided that they would allow a 2-year phase-in approach before the full 5-year would take effect. So that allowed those small businesses that weren't yet prepared for a 5-year look back to again have their 3-year look back as they were phased into the 5 years. So it was a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely. And I mentioned in some of the discussion a case study that I've been working on with the Premium Cigar Association involving, pre-market authorization and substantial equivalence of tobacco products. That has been something that, we've engaged on for a number of years with different stakeholders, ranging from Congress to the agencies to the White House, to the courts, and we were successfully able to get temporary relief via court order, and that has been an important thing. And I think for those of the folks that are in the trade association world, they can relate to this quite a bit. Our members, we have consistently had to explain the process, where things in the timeline are going, what they need to expect, what compliance would look like. We had to undergo shifting deadlines from the enactment date, and eventually were able to successfully get a part of the regulation overturned, as I mentioned, from the litigation front. But it was a three-pronged strategy, legislative, regulatory, and legal, that came together. And I think the phase that we're in right now is explaining that success, explaining, that our industry was able to save millions of dollars, that jobs in key states that were protected as a result of that decision. And also, in the association world, explaining that this is your advocacy in action, that this is a key member benefit of why you participate in the association, and fundraising even off of that for future legal battles. Anything in politics is temporary. So, as soon as we're celebrating that victory, the conversation quickly pivoted into what's next. What can we expect from an administration change, or what can we expect in the dynamics of a congressional change? What is on the frontier? And I think the organizations that are most successful at being engaged in the legislative process, but also in the regulatory process, is being able to think about, 3 to 5 years, or 3 to 5 months. What do those scenarios look like? And that's why I think webinars and discussions like this are so important, where you get to see experts and talk with experts about their firsthand knowledge, and some case studies about how that all comes together and how it's interconnected. We have a couple minutes for some audience questions. We got one, and I'm going to ask Dimitri to answer this one first. Do you have any tips on writing public comments? For example, is volume or quantity over quality better?
I would never sacrifice, I think, the quality and the substantive quality of the comments for quantity. The comments are not just read by technical experts at agencies. You often have, political folks who are, about an inch deep and a mile wide in a number of different issues. They're not likely to go through 200, 300 pages that come in from every single commenting party. So there is a benefit to being kind of concise. I think if you have, enough information to be, have a lot of volume there, then that's great. I wouldn't not include it, but I wouldn't sacrifice the quality for the quantity. And I also think boiling it down to the extent you can in some sort of executive summary or way that somebody who doesn't have time to go through, or his job isn't to go through all of those comments, can review it and get a gist of it is probably very helpful as well.
Tanya, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I just keep in mind that those comments are available to the public, and occasionally Congress will also refer to something that they have seen as far as a comment on an issue that they care about. So I think quality is very important, and I agree with Dimitri on that point.
Absolutely. And I got another audience question. I'm going to ask this to Tanya first. How do you feel about lobbying agency staff directly? Do you have any tips for that?
Well, trying to lobby agency staff is more difficult. One, if you're lobbying, you want to provide them with information that has support, broad support. I would also recommend a congressional office to possibly to weigh in on your behalf. At least that's how I've done it in the past, because a member of Congress has more sway, if you will, or influence with an agency than any one individual or organization necessarily would have. But that doesn't preclude you from making an attempt to present your concern. It's very helpful. However, if you belong to an association where it's a collective voice of concerns that represent either a single industry or a number of industries that a particular action or implemented rule would affect, to register that. But always, from my perspective, it does still help to get a member of Congress involved. By way of example, years ago, I represented an organization, a healthcare organization out of California, and they were having a lot of difficulty with a particular interpretation of a rule out of HHS, and the member of Congress called up HHS along with the client and talked through the problem. That was very helpful to the client to approach it that way.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100% on the members of Congress weighing in. I think one of the biggest tips and tricks is really identifying all of the decision makers across the variety of agencies and organizations. A lot of times the jurisdictions overlap, so you're not necessarily lobbying one single agency. It might involve other entities. So one of the other things that we've done successfully in the past is hosted listening sessions, for example, with the Small Business Administration, where we invite other stakeholders at HHS, FDA, and members of Congress to participate and listen in, to really explain the soup to nuts version of our issue. And that's an opportunity where we've had the ability to have our staff experts involved, but also key stakeholders that are volunteer leadership that can explain it from the firsthand perspective of being a premium cigar manufacturer or retailer. So we've seen success there in listening sessions and public forums. But Dimitri, do you have any final thoughts on that?
I would just go back to some points that have been, previously discussed. Just know your audience. Obviously agency staff includes both career staff and political staff. When you're talking to political staff, you may want to be a little bit higher level. You may want to interject some of the administration's or that the head of that agency's kind of themes into the discussion. Career staff stick around. They're here administration to administration, and just be mindful of that. They are people, and despite the fact they're civil servants and they're carrying out kind of the mission that's sent down from above, you may want to tell the Biden political how bad the Trump rule is. If you meet with the career official who spent 4 years writing the Trump rule, you may not want to, come in with the same level of criticism. So just be mindful of who you're talking to, and understand kind of some of their experience and motivations as well.
Well, this has been a great conversation, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Dimitri and Tanya, thank you so much for taking the time to participate today. It's been an insightful conversation. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us. Time is a precious resource, so we appreciate you spending the past hour of your day with us. Look for a follow-up email in your inbox shortly with a link to today's recording. Finally, I'd like to plug FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call's regulatory report again. This report builds off our conversation today and covers a lot of the topics we discussed. If you or your team has been tasked with following regulations, I highly recommend you download the report by going to FiscalNote.com. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day to all of you.